I'm going to say this one more time, old man. Mind your own business. Officer Chester Fisher's voice was sharp, a final warning before his open hand came back in a wide, theatrical arc and cracked across the old man's face, hard enough to echo off the mall's ceiling. The mall went silent. Marco Calvert's head turned with the impact. He didn't stumble or reach for his cheek. He simply stood there silently with his hands at his sides, while Fisher rolled his shoulder back with the lazy satisfaction of a man who carried the certainty that life usually bent to his will. What Officer Chester Fisher didn't know was that he had just put his hands on the last man on Earth who knew exactly how to finish a fight. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you can't miss. The mall was loud the way malls always got in December. Christmas music bouncing off tile floors, kids pulling at their mother's sleeves, the smell of cinnamon from a candle store mixing with fried food from somewhere down the hall. Marco Calvert moved through all of it slowly, unhurried, the way a man moves when he has nowhere urgent to be, and has learned, over a long life, to be grateful for that. He was 68 years old, silver-haired, pressed dark slacks, a gray cardigan buttoned to the second from top. His late wife, Claire, used to say he dressed like he was always expecting company. He never stopped. He stopped at the jewelry counter inside Riverside Commons and looked down through the glass. 2 necklaces, both silver. One with a small star pendant, one with a thin chain, and a delicate letter, J. Jessica, his granddaughter. 12 years old in 3 weeks, and already too smart for half the adults in her life, which made him prouder than he ever said out loud. "The J one," said Eric, appearing at his elbow. Marco didn't look up. "I didn't ask. You've been staring at that case for 4 minutes. You need help." Eric Washington was 71, retired from 30 years with the Postal Service, and had strong opinions about everything. He was Marco's oldest friend, which meant Marco had spent decades ignoring his strong opinions with great patience and genuine affection. "The star," Marco said. "She's 12, not 9. Stars don't have an age. The J1 says her name is important. The star says—" "Eric." "What?" "Be quiet a minute." Eric was quiet for approximately 45 seconds, which was the longest he ever managed. The sales associate, a young woman with a name tag that said Brielle, leaned across the counter with a warm smile. "Can I take either one out for you, sir?" "The star, please," Marco said. She set it on the velvet pad between them. Marco picked it up carefully. He turned it in his fingers. Small. Simple. The kind of thing a girl could grow into rather than out of. Claire would have known immediately which one was right. She always did. Marco had been making these calls alone for 4 years now, and he still second-guessed himself every time. He set it back down. "I'll take it." Brielle smiled and reached for the box. Behind him, the mall moved. Marco watched its reflection in the glass case without appearing to watch anything at all. A security guard crossing the far end of the atrium. A family arguing about where to eat. 2 teenagers moving too fast near the entrance, the way teenagers always did. Like stillness was something that happened to other people. His eyes moved across all of it, the way water moves across a floor. Quiet. Complete. Finding every edge. He had done this so long he didn't notice he was doing it anymore. "You want it gift-wrapped?" Brielle asked. "Please." Eric leaned on the counter. "You should get the J1, too. Backup gift, in case she hates the star." "She won't hate the star." "You don't know that." "I know my granddaughter. You see her 4 times a year." Marco looked at him. "Eric, I'm just saying." Children are unpredictable. My granddaughter went through a phase where she only wore orange. Nobody predicted that. Brielle was wrapping the box. She was trying not to smile and losing. Marco turned back to the counter. He watched his own reflection for a moment in the dark glass. An old man in a good cardigan, buying a Christmas gift. This was his life now, and he had built it carefully. The garden out back. Phone calls on Sundays. Jessica's voice on the other end, telling him about her week with the particular urgency of someone who needed to be heard and knew she was. It was a quiet life. It was the life he had chosen when there was finally a choice to make. Brielle slid the wrapped box across the counter. "She's going to love it." Marco picked it up. "Thank you." He and Eric moved away from the counter, heading toward the food court. Eric was already talking about where to eat. Marco listened with half his attention. With the other half, he did what he had always done, what had kept him alive in places he never talked about. He watched. The sound reached Marco first. Not words, just a voice, raised, deliberate, carrying the particular edge of someone who wanted to be heard. Not because they were scared, because they were in charge, and they wanted everyone nearby to know it. Marco slowed. 20 yards ahead, outside a clothing store with a red sales sign in the window, a man in a Caldwell PD uniform had a young woman by the upper arm. She was maybe 24. Black. Still wearing nursing scrubs. The pale blue kind. The ones that meant a long shift. She was holding a small paper receipt out toward the officer with her free hand, her arm fully extended, the way you hold something out to a person who keeps refusing to look at it. The officer wasn't looking at it. He was broad, younger than he carried himself. His name tag said Fisher. He had the stance of a man who had done this before, feet planted wide, chin slightly elevated, voice just loud enough to pull an audience. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to calm down." "I am calm," the young woman said. Her voice was steady but thin, stretched tight over something that was trying very hard not to shake. "I have my receipt. I paid for the scarf. It is in the bag." "That's what you're telling me." "That's what the receipt says. Receipts can be faked." She stared at him. "I bought a $12 scarf." Fisher's mouth curved. Just slightly. Like this was mildly entertaining. A small crowd had formed the way mall crowds always do. Close enough to watch, far enough to pretend they weren't. Nobody was moving. Nobody was saying anything. A woman with a stroller had stopped, and then very deliberately turned and walked the other way. Eric's hand found Marco's sleeve. "Don't," he said quietly. Marco watched the young woman's face. He watched her try to keep it together. The controlled breathing, the careful voice, the way her eyes were bright and wide because she knew, the way every black woman in America learns to know, that losing her composure right now would become the story, that her fear would be used as evidence of something, that there was no version of this where she was simply right, and he was simply wrong, and it ended there. She was doing everything correctly, and it wasn't working. "Don't," Eric said again. Marco handed him the gift bag. He walked forward at the same pace he'd been walking all afternoon, unhurried. No tension in his shoulders. He stopped about 6 feet from Fisher and the young woman, and he said, clearly and without raising his voice, "Excuse me." Fisher turned. He looked Marco up and down the way some men do. The quick assessment, the instant categorization. Old man. Cardigan. Not a threat. "Sir, this doesn't concern you. Keep moving. My name is Marco Calvert. I was standing at the jewelry counter across the atrium when this young woman entered that store. And when she left it, he kept his voice level, factual, the voice of a man making a report. She did not behave suspiciously. She made a purchase. I watched her do it. Fisher stared at him for a moment. Good for you. Now keep moving. There's no probable cause for detention. Something shifted in Fisher's face. The mild amusement hardened into something else. I'm going to say this one more time. He took a step toward Marco. Mind your business. Behind Marco, Eric said quietly, urgently, Marco, come on, let it go. The young woman's eyes moved to Marco. He caught them for just a second. In them, something. Not hope exactly, but the exhausted recognition of someone who had stopped expecting anyone to step forward and didn't know what to do now that someone had. Marco didn't move. He looked at Fisher. He didn't look away, didn't shift his weight, didn't blink. He simply stood in the particular way that some men stand when they have been in rooms far more dangerous than this one, and decided the outcome each time. She's free to go, Marco said. The silence around them went very still. Fisher's jaw tightened. He looked at Marco the way men like him look at people who refuse to shrink. Like the refusal itself was a personal offense. Like dignity, in someone he'd already decided didn't deserve it, was the most aggravating thing in the world. He leaned in slightly. Boy, he said. Back. Up. The word landed like it was meant to. Loud enough for the people around them to hear. Deliberate. A test and a statement at the same time. Marco didn't move. Not even a little. Fisher's hand came back. Open palm. A wide, theatrical arc. The kind of swing that wanted an audience. His eyes were on Marco the whole time, mean and bright, absolutely certain of what came next. The crack of it echoed off the atrium ceiling. Marco's head turned with the impact. A sharp, clean sound. His eyes went to the floor for just a moment. Not from pain, not from shock, but the way a man's eyes move when something lands and the body registers it before the mind decides what to do next. For 1 full second, nobody in that mall made a sound. Fisher liked that second. You could see it on his face. The silence. The stillness. The old man absorbing it. He rolled his shoulder back with the easy comfort of someone who had just confirmed something he already believed about the world. His hand came back a second time. Same arc, same confidence, same absolute certainty of what came next. It didn't land. Later, people would try to describe what they saw. They would use words like fast and impossible, and I don't even know how to explain it. A woman near the pretzel stand would tell her daughter that the first slap happened before anyone could react, but the second one never had a chance. A teenage boy would post the video with shaking hands before he even fully understood what he'd filmed. What happened next took 2 seconds, maybe less. Marco didn't stumble from the first hit, didn't reach for his face, didn't make a sound. The moment Fisher's hand came back for the second swing, Marco's left hand came up and took hold of Fisher's extended right wrist. Mid-arc, clean, like plucking something from the air. And then several things happened in a sequence so practiced, it looked almost calm. A step inward, inside Fisher's guard, close enough that size meant nothing. A rotation of the wrist, outward, precise, applied to the exact degree that the joint allowed and no further. A controlled forward press, using Fisher's own weight and momentum against him. And then Chester Fisher, 6 feet tall, 210 pounds, 17-year veteran of intimidating people in public spaces, was face down on the mall tile, with his cheek pressed against the linoleum and his own heartbeat hammering in his ears. His sidearm had skidded 8 feet across the floor. Marco stepped back. He reached up and adjusted his cardigan. He looked at Fisher on the ground, breathing hard, uninjured, staring at the floor with the expression of a man whose entire understanding of the situation had just collapsed, and said, quietly and without heat, "You should stay there." Then the mall exploded. Not violence, just sound. Voices, all at once, from every direction. Someone screamed. Someone laughed. A short, shocked bark of disbelief. 3 people started talking over each other. A child somewhere started crying because the adults around him had suddenly stopped acting like adults. The young woman in the nursing scrubs, her name was Bella Darter, though Marco didn't know that yet, stood completely still with the receipt still in her hand. She was staring at Marco the way people look at something they don't have a category for. 15 feet away, Kevin Jagger had stopped moving entirely. He was 17, worked the pretzel stand 3 days a week, and was saving for community college. His phone was in his hand. He had started filming when the old man in the cardigan first walked up. Something about the whole scene had made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up, and he had not stopped. He had everything. From the beginning. Fisher grabbing Bella. The receipt. The word boy. The first slap landing. The second slap stopped cold. The 2 seconds. All of it. Eric Washington stood 10 feet behind Marco, with the gift bag dangling from his fingers and an expression on his face that was equal parts laughter and prayer. A second officer arrived at a jog 90 seconds later. Younger than Fisher, visibly uncertain. He helped Fisher off the floor. Fisher's face was red. He was breathing through his nose in short, controlled pulls. He did not look at Marco. Out of pure reflex, the muscle memory of a man who needed to be in control of something, Fisher turned to Bella and said, "You're under arrest." His partner put a hand on his arm, said something quietly, gestured at the 40 people standing in a half-circle around them, several with their phones raised, pointed at the receipt still in Bella's hand. Fisher released her 40 seconds after he'd grabbed her. Bella didn't run. She walked away steadily, her back straight, and didn't look back. Marco returned to the jewelry counter. Brielle, the sales associate, was gripping the edge of the display case with both hands, her hands trembling. She processed the transaction in near silence. When it was done, she gave him a 20% discount she invented on the spot because she couldn't think of anything else to do. "Thank you," Marco said. He and Eric walked out of Riverside Commons into the cold December afternoon. Eric didn't say a word the entire way to the car, which was the quietest he'd been in 30 years. At 4:47 p.m., Kevin Jagger uploaded the video. By midnight, 6 million people had watched an old man in a gray cardigan take a hit, catch the second one, and put a cop on the floor of a Georgia mall. The title, Grandpa Don't Play. Bill Glassner watched the video 3 times. He didn't watch it the way most people did, leaning forward, mouth open, replaying the 2 seconds over and over. He watched it the way a man watches something he needs to fully understand before he decides what to do about it. Still. Quiet. His office door closed, his desk phone face down, the early morning light coming through the blinds in thin gray strips. 6 million views. He closed the laptop. He picked up his phone and made 3 calls. The first to the mall's director of security. The second to DA Walter Creed. The third to his nephew. Each call was short. Each call was calm. Each call ended the same way, with the other person understanding exactly what was needed without Glassner having to say it plainly. That was the thing about a machine that had been running for 20 years. You didn't have to explain it anymore. You just turned the key. By 9 o'clock that morning, Chester Fisher was sitting across from Glassner with a legal pad and a pen, writing his incident report. "Take your time," Glassner told him. "Be thorough." Fisher wrote for 40 minutes. When he was done, the report described an elderly male civilian who had inserted himself into an active law enforcement situation, refused repeated lawful orders to disperse, and then executed what appeared to be a trained combat maneuver that caused the officer to fear for his safety and his life. There was no mention of a slap. There was no mention of a receipt. There was no mention of a young woman in nursing scrubs who had done nothing wrong. Glassner read it over once, nodded, and signed the bottom. By 11 o'clock, the Caldwell Police Department had issued its public statement. It was careful language, the kind that sounded measured and reasonable to anyone who hadn't seen the video, and that gave just enough cover to anyone who had. An ongoing investigation into an assault on a law enforcement officer. The department takes all such incidents seriously. We ask the public to withhold judgment until all facts are known. Fisher's photo ran alongside it. Professional headshot. Flag in the background. 17 years of service. By 1 o'clock, D.A. Walter Creed had signaled to the Caldwell Courier that he was reviewing the matter for charges. The Courier's front page the following morning would carry a headline about an officer assaulted by an unidentified aggressor, a phrase that would have seemed almost funny if the stakes weren't what they were. The video was still spreading. Glassner knew he couldn't touch that. It was everywhere. National news, social media, morning radio. People were calling Marco a hero. People were calling for Fisher's badge. The noise was loud, and it was coming from everywhere at once. But noise wasn't law. Noise wasn't a courtroom. Noise was just noise, and Glassner had outlasted noise before. What he could control was the local machinery, the framing, the charges, the timeline. He had run this city for a long time, and he had not done it by panicking when things got loud. He made one more call, to the clothing store's regional legal team. The conversation was brief. By the following morning, the store would issue a statement saying no formal shoplifting accusation had ever been filed, and that they regretted any misunderstanding. Chester Fisher's name would not appear anywhere in it. At 2:14 in the afternoon, two officers in a marked cruiser pulled up in front of a small house on Delwood Street with a garden out front that had been carefully maintained through the winter. Marco answered the door in the same cardigan. He looked at the two officers on his porch. He looked past them at the cruiser idling at the curb. He didn't say anything. He simply waited, with the patience of a man who had been in harder situations than this, and understood that sometimes you waited to hear what was coming before you decided how to meet it. They told him he was under arrest for felony assault on a law enforcement officer. He asked if he could get his coat. They said yes. He got his coat. He locked his front door. He walked to the cruiser without being guided and got in the back seat on his own. The neighbors who watched from their windows would later say he looked the same as he always did. Like nothing about this surprised him. Like he had already decided, somewhere quiet inside himself, exactly how he was going to carry it. Eric Washington saw the cruiser from across the street and went inside to find his phone. He called Angela at 2:31. She picked up on the second ring. Angela drove the 2 hours from Atlanta in under 90 minutes. She didn't remember most of the drive. She remembered the phone call. She remembered Eric's voice, steady, but with something underneath it that Eric Washington, who had an opinion about everything and was never at a loss for words, almost never showed. Something that sounded like fear, dressed up as calm. They put your father in handcuffs, Angela. In front of the whole neighborhood. She remembered pulling out of the parking garage. She didn't remember much after that until the Caldwell County Jail processing entrance was in front of her, and she was pushing through the glass door with her briefcase and her bar credentials and years of wrongful arrest litigation experience and the particular fury of a daughter who had been told, her entire life, that the law was a system worth believing in. She posted bail from her firm's emergency fund and waited. Marco came through the processing door at 8:47 in the evening. He was carrying his folded cardigan over one arm. His collar was still straight. He looked at Angela the way he always looked at her, steady, quiet, taking her in like she was something he was grateful for. And she had to press her back teeth together to keep her face from doing something she didn't want it to do in a county jail lobby. She hugged him. He held on a moment longer than usual. Then he said, "You didn't have to drive tonight. Daddy, I'm serious." It could have waited until... It could not have waited. He looked like he might argue. He didn't. The bail conditions were read to Angela by a clerk who had the decency to look mildly uncomfortable delivering them. No contact with any mall employees. A 1-mile exclusion radius from Riverside Commons Mall. Surrendered passport. Effective immediately. She filed for a rapid hearing before they left the building and was given a date 3 weeks out. 3 weeks. She didn't say what she was thinking. She thanked the clerk and guided her father to the car. They sat at his kitchen table until almost midnight. Angela had her legal pad. She had her pen. She had the charge sheet, which she had already read 4 times, and which got worse every time. She asked Marco questions. He answered them carefully and completely, the way he did everything, without rushing, without editorializing, giving her only what was true and exactly what she needed. She had the whole incident documented in 40 minutes. She set her pen down. Then she asked him the other question, the one she had never asked before, not properly, not with the full weight of it behind the words. She asked him to tell her everything, not just about the mall, about all of it, about what he had actually done for 30 years before he retired to this house and this garden, and Sunday phone calls with his granddaughter. Marco looked at his hands on the table for a long moment. Then he told her. He spoke quietly and without drama, the way you describe things that happened long enough ago that the sharpest edges have worn down, but the shape of them hasn't changed. He talked for a long time. Angela did not interrupt. She did not write anything down. She just listened. And the woman who had sat in depositions and courtrooms and hostile boardrooms for 15 years sat very still at her father's kitchen table and listened to who her father actually was. When he finished, the kitchen was quiet. Angela looked at him. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Marco was quiet for a moment. He looked at the window, at the dark garden beyond it. "Because I wanted you to be proud of me for the garden," he said. She looked at him for a long time. There were things she wanted to say. She couldn't find the shape of any of them. So she reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, and he turned his palm up and held on. He went to bed an hour later. She heard him moving in his room, heard a closet open, heard a box being lifted down from a shelf, heard him set it on something solid, heard it open. A long silence. Then it closed. Then nothing. Angela sat alone at the kitchen table. She opened her legal pad to a fresh page. At the top, she wrote 3 things in her clean, precise handwriting. Marco James Calvert, defendant, my father. She underlined it twice. Then she picked up her pen, and she began. The next 3 days moved in 2 directions at once. Angela built. Glassner buried. They worked in parallel. One at a kitchen table with a legal pad and a laptop, the other behind a closed office door with a phone and 20 years of favors to call in. Neither one could see the other clearly yet, but both of them knew the other was there. Angela was up before 6 every morning. She mapped the case across 3 legal pads, color-coded with sticky tabs. She pulled precedent. She contacted witnesses. She called Bella Darter, who answered on the first ring and said yes. Yes, she would testify. Yes, she would put everything in writing. Yes, she understood what that might mean, and she was doing it anyway. Angela wrote Bella's name at the top of a fresh page and underlined it. She called Eric, who said, "Tell me what you need, and I'll be there." She started building something real. Glassner was building something too. On the second morning, the police union went on local radio. The spokesperson, a thick-voiced man named Jerry Pitts, who had been doing this for 11 years, described the mall incident as an unprovoked, trained attack on a uniformed officer performing his lawful duties. He used the word trained 3 times. He talked about officer safety. He talked about the dangers of the job. He did not mention Bella Darter once. That same afternoon, the clothing store released its statement. 2 careful paragraphs. Regret for any misunderstanding. No formal accusation was ever filed. The store valued all its customers. Chester Fisher's name did not appear anywhere in it. Their legal team had called Glassner's assistant the morning before. Angela read the statement at the kitchen table and circled the phrase, "No formal accusation," twice. Hard enough that the pen tore slightly through the paper. Then came Kevin Jagger. He was 17 years old, and he had filmed the whole thing, and the video had been seen by 12 million people by the time the mall called him in. The manager, a soft-faced man in a department store tie, who could not look Kevin directly in the eye, explained that Kevin's use of his personal device during working hours was a violation of mall employment policy. Effective immediately. Kevin asked if this was because of the video. The manager said it was a policy matter. Kevin asked when they had ever enforced that policy before. The manager said he was free to collect his things from his locker. Kevin was the only income in his household 3 days a week. He had $412 saved toward community college. He walked out of the mall in his pretzel stand uniform and sat in his car in the parking lot for a long time before he started the engine. Angela didn't know about Kevin yet. She would. On the 3rd morning, D.A. Walter Creed made it official. He held a brief press conference outside the county courthouse. Blue tie, practiced expression of reluctant civic duty, and announced that after reviewing the evidence, his office would be pursuing the maximum available charge. 4 years. Angela watched it on her laptop at Marco's kitchen table. Marco was in the garden. She did not call him inside to watch it. She called her co-counsel in Atlanta instead, a woman named Diane, 15 years of civil rights litigation, the sharpest pattern of conduct attorney Angela knew. "I need everything we have on department misconduct cases," Angela said. "Buried complaints, systemic cover, pattern of conduct defenses, everything." Diane said, "How bad is it?" Angela looked at the charge sheet on the table. "They're going after a 68-year-old Medal of Honor recipient for defending himself after a cop slapped him in a shopping mall." She paused. "So, yeah, it's bad." Diane said, I'll pull the files tonight." Angela hung up and stared at the wall. Outside, she could hear Marco moving between the garden beds. The quiet, unhurried sound of a man doing something with his hands that gave him peace. She had watched him out there every morning since she arrived, tending things, patient, deliberate. He never looked worried. She did not know if that was strength or simply a man who had learned, in places she was only beginning to understand, to keep his fear where nobody could see it. She picked up her pen. At the top of a fresh legal pad page, she wrote, "Who has Fisher done this to before?" She stared at the question for a long time. Then she drew a line down the center of the page and started filling in both sides. The text came at 6:52 in the morning. Angela was on her second coffee, legal pad open, when her phone buzzed on the kitchen table. Unknown number. One line, "I have something you need to see. I can't come to your office. Name a place." She stared at it for a long moment. In 15 years of law, anonymous contacts had gone two ways. They were either exactly what they claimed to be, or they were the other thing entirely. A setup, a distraction, something designed to pull you sideways when you needed to be moving straight. She typed back, "Caldwell Memorial Park, the bench by the East Pond, 7 o'clock tonight." No response came. No confirmation. Just silence. The way silence comes when someone has already made their decision and doesn't need to discuss it. Angela set her phone down and went back to her legal pad. But she didn't write anything for a while. She arrived at the park 10 minutes early. The December air was sharp and clean. The pond was gray and still, edged with frost at the banks. A few ducks moved near the far side. The bench faced the water with its back to the walking path, which meant she could hear footsteps approaching without appearing to watch for them. Marco had taught her that. She hadn't known until 3 nights ago why she'd always done it. The footsteps came at 7 exactly. The woman who sat down beside her was black, mid-40s, and dressed in civilian clothes. Jeans, a dark jacket, a wool hat pulled low. She moved with the contained, deliberate posture of someone who had spent years being watched and had learned to take up exactly as much space as she needed, and no more. She didn't introduce herself immediately. She looked at the pond for a moment. Then she said, "My name is Penny Dillon. I'm a lieutenant with the Caldwell Police Department." She paused. "For now." Angela looked at her. Dillon reached into the jacket and produced a manila folder. She held it out. Angela took it. Inside were pages, clean, organized, dated, summaries, case numbers, incident logs, names, addresses, brief descriptions of what had happened and when. Angela read the first page, then the second. She slowed down on the third. 14 complaints, Dillon said. 4 years. Excessive force. Discriminatory targeting. In 2 cases, physical contact. A Latino man outside a convenience store in 2021 and a black teenager in a park in 2022. She said it the way you say something you have said inside your own head. So many times it has lost its shape, but none of its weight. Every single complaint was received. Every one was assigned a case number, and every one was closed without action. Angela looked up. Closed by who? 12 of them were under Captain Glassner's direct authority. Dillon's voice didn't waver. The other 2 went to a supervisor who understood which way the wind blew. Angela looked back at the folder. She turned another page. Another name? Another date? Another buried case number. "How long have you been building this?" she asked. 3 years. Dillon looked at the pond. "The first time I tried to move it up the chain, I was passed over for a promotion I had earned by every measurable standard. The second time, my partner was reassigned without explanation. The third time, a senior officer sat across from me in a conference room and told me, calmly, professionally, like he was giving me career advice, that this was not a path I wanted to go down. The ducks moved across the gray water. Neither woman watched them. "So why now?" Angela asked. Dylan was quiet for a moment. "Because I've spent 3 years telling myself I was being strategic," she said. "That I was waiting for the right moment, the right case, the right set of circumstances." She stopped, started again. "They arrested a 68-year-old man in handcuffs and walked him out of his house in front of his neighbor. And I watched it happen on the news in my living room, and I thought—" She stopped again. Her jaw was tight. "I'm done being strategic." Angela closed the folder carefully. "If I use this," she said, "your name will eventually come out. You understand that?" "I do. Glassner will come after you. I know what Glassner does." Dylan looked at her directly for the first time. "I've watched him do it for 4 years. I'm not afraid of him." She said it plainly. Not bravely. Just as a fact. Angela held the folder against her chest. "I'll need a sworn remote affidavit," she said. "Secure channel. I can have the setup to you by tomorrow morning." Dylan nodded. She stood, buttoned her jacket, and walked back up the path without looking back. Angela sat alone on the bench for a long time after that. The frost was thickening at the edge of the pond. She opened the folder again in the dark and read every one of the 14 names, slowly, one by one. Each one was somebody's father, somebody's son, somebody's neighbor. Her jaw tightened with every page. The request was 3 paragraphs long and took Angela 11 minutes to write. She had drafted longer briefs in her sleep. But this one required something different, a particular kind of precision, because she was asking a federal government agency to unseal a document about her father, and she was doing it as his attorney. And she needed every word to carry both of those weights at once without buckling under either. She filed it at 7 a.m. The Department of Defense acknowledgement came back at 7:43. Automated, impersonal, informing her that her request had been received and would require 2 separate security clearance verifications before processing. Estimated return, 48 hours. She printed the acknowledgement and added it to the file. Then she waited. The folder arrived electronically 49 hours later, at 9 in the morning. Angela opened it at the kitchen table with a fresh coffee and her reading glasses and the quiet, systematic focus she brought to every document that mattered. She expected 4 pages, maybe 6. The document was 41 pages long. She set her coffee down. Most of it was black, not blacked out the way civilian records sometimes were. A word here, a name there. This was whole pages reduced to single visible lines, entire paragraphs where only a date or a location code survived. Deployment records that started and stopped abruptly, not because the missions ended, but because what happened in them was still, decades later, something the government had decided the public didn't need to know. Angela read what was visible slowly and completely. 31 years of Special Operations service. That much was clear. 3 confirmed combat theaters named. Commendations that referenced actions the commendations themselves did not describe. A record of a man who had spent the better part of his adult life going to places that didn't officially exist, and doing things that were never officially confirmed, and coming home afterward to a house on Delwood Street with a garden and a wife and a daughter who thought her father had worked in military logistics. She turned to the final section. It was dated 2009, a formal amendment to the service record. She read the heading twice before it settled. A military honor, originally issued as a classified Silver Star, had been reviewed and upgraded. Effective immediately upon review, Marco James Calvert was the recipient of the Medal of Honor. The citation below it was 2 paragraphs. The first was almost entirely redacted. The second was not. In defense of civilian non-combatants, under conditions of direct and sustained enemy fire, Sergeant Major Calvert demonstrated singular acts of personal valor that resulted in the preservation of multiple civilian lives. His actions on this date, carried out without order and without regard for personal safety, represent the highest standard of selfless service this nation can recognize. Location of action: Mogadishu, Somalia. Date: October 4th, 1993. Angela read it 3 times. October 4th, 1993. She knew that date. Everyone who had ever read about that era knew it. The day the whole thing came apart. The day that city swallowed American soldiers whole, and the news cameras captured enough of it to make the country flinch. Her father had been there. Her father had been there, and he had put himself between civilians and people trying to kill them, and he had come home and said nothing, and planted roses, and argued with Eric about jewelry, and called his granddaughter every Sunday like it was the most important thing he did all week. Which, she understood suddenly, it probably was. She sat at the table for a long time. The house was quiet around her. The garden was dark through the window. She found him outside. He was crouching near the far bed, doing something with the soil near the base of one of Claire's roses, unhurried, the way he always was out here. She said, "Daddy." He looked up. She said, "You have a Medal of Honor." He looked at her for a moment. Then he stood and brushed the dirt from his hands. "It's in a box," he said. "Why didn't you ever tell anyone?" He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the rose bed, then back at her. "Those weren't my medals to be proud of," he said. "Those were days I survived." He paused. "The men who didn't survive, those were the heroes." Angela stood in the cold garden beside her father and could not find a single word that was big enough for what she was feeling. So she said nothing. She just stood there. And after a moment, Marco went back to the roses, and she stayed until the cold pushed her inside. She left the folder open on the kitchen table. She didn't close it that night. Nobody ever told Glassner directly that Dylan had talked. Nobody had to. 20 years of running a department taught you to read the temperature of a room, to notice which conversations stopped when you walked in, to feel the particular shift that happened when someone inside your machine had decided they were no longer part of it. Glassner had felt that shift before. He knew exactly what it meant and exactly what to do about it. He made 2 calls on a Tuesday morning. By afternoon, the paperwork was already moving. Penny Dillon was at her desk reviewing shift reports when her supervising officer appeared in her doorway. He was a man she had worked alongside for 9 years. He didn't look at her directly when he spoke. He told her she was being placed on administrative suspension, effective immediately, pending an internal investigation. The allegation: a falsified overtime report submitted 18 months prior. Dillon set down her pen. She asked him to repeat the specific allegation. He did. His eyes stayed somewhere near her left shoulder. She thought about the overtime report he was describing. She remembered filling it out. She remembered it being accurate because she was constitutionally incapable of submitting something she knew was wrong, which was precisely the thing that had made the last 4 years inside this department so exhausting. "This is fabricated," she said. He said the investigation would determine that. She said, "We both know what this is, Carl." He didn't answer. He told her to surrender her badge and her service weapon, and that she was to remain available for questioning, but was not to report to the building until further notice. She placed her badge on the desk between them. She placed her weapon beside it. She stood, picked up her jacket and her personal items, and walked out of the Caldwell Police Department without saying another word to anyone. She sat in her car in the parking structure for 10 minutes. Then she drove home. She did not call Angela. Angela's affidavit had already been submitted through the secure channel 2 days prior. Whatever Glassner was trying to prevent, he was too late. By exactly 48 hours. The upgraded charges landed the following morning. Angela was at the kitchen table when her phone rang. It was the clerk from the DA's office, a young woman who read the amended charge sheet in the careful, neutral voice of someone who understood they were delivering bad news and had been trained not to show it. In addition to the existing felony assault count, Marco Calvert would now face a charge of resisting detainment, arising from his failure to immediately comply when Officer Fisher first ordered him to back away. Combined maximum sentence, 4 to 7 years. Angela wrote the number down. She stared at it. 7 years. Her father was 68 years old. She thanked the clerk and ended the call. She picked up her pen. She set it back down. She stood up and went to the window and looked at the garden for a full minute, breathing deliberately, the way she had learned to breathe in the moments before a difficult cross-examination when everything depended on her keeping her head clear. Then she went back to the table and filed the emergency motion to dismiss before noon. She told Marco over dinner. He listened to the full summary without interrupting. The fabricated allegation against Dylan, the timing of it, the upgraded charges, the new maximum sentence. When she finished, the kitchen was quiet. Marco looked at his plate for a moment. Then he looked at Angela. "Dylan's affidavit," he said. "Is it already submitted?" 2 days ago. He nodded slowly. "So he's too late." "For that, yes." Angela looked at him. "But the upgraded charges are real. The hearing is set. And Daddy—" She stopped. Started again. "Judge Birch is assigned to the motion." She watched his face to see if the name registered. It did. Even Marco, who didn't follow local politics closely, knew the name Franklin Birch. Caldwell was not a big city. Marco picked up his fork. He took a bite. He chewed thoughtfully. Then he said, "When's the hearing?" She told him. He nodded. He stood up from the table, carried his plate to the sink, and rinsed it with the same unhurried movements he used for everything. Then he went to the back door and stepped outside into the dark garden, and she heard him out there for a long time afterward, moving slowly between the beds, quiet and deliberate. She sat at the table with the charge sheet in front of her. 7 years. She picked up her pen and got back to work. The courtroom filled up fast. By 8:30 in the morning, every seat in the gallery was taken. People stood along the back wall. More filled the hallway outside, pressing close to the doors, passing information back in low voices. Angela had seen packed courtrooms before, had been in some of the most watched civil rights cases in Georgia in the last decade. But there was something different about this one. Something that lived in the particular silence of 300 people who had driven here, taken the day off work, pulled their children out of school, because they needed to see this with their own eyes. Marco sat at the defense table in a dark suit and a white shirt. His hands were folded in front of him. His face was composed and still, the way it always was, not cold, just settled. like a man who had already made peace with whatever was coming and was simply waiting to find out what it was. Angela stood beside him and felt no such peace. She presented everything. The unedited video played 3 times on the courtroom screen, beginning to end, no cuts. The crack of the first slap. The second swing stopped cold. The 2 seconds. The crowd. Fisher's face when he got up off the floor. She let it play without commentary because it didn't need any. General Rudy Paul Ashford's written statement was entered into the record. Judge Birch read it in full from the bench, and the courtroom watched him read it. 4 pages, single-spaced, from a 4-star general who had commanded Special Operations Forces across 3 decades and chose to spend his measured, careful words on what kind of man Marco Calvert was and what kind of career he had lived. When Birch set the pages down, his expression gave nothing away. Dillon's affidavit, submitted 48 hours before her suspension made it impossible, was entered. 14 complaints, 4 years, every case number, every burial. Then the witnesses. Bella Darter sat in the witness chair, in a pressed blazer, and told the courtroom what happened. She was calm and clear and precise, and when the DA's attorney tried to suggest she had been agitated and difficult to manage that day, she looked at him steadily and said, "I had a receipt. I showed it to him 4 times. You can see it in the video." She said it without anger. Just as a fact. The gallery was very quiet. Eric testified. He was 71 years old, and he told the truth with the plain, unadorned directness of a man who had nothing to protect except his integrity, and he had been protecting that his whole life without difficulty. Kevin Jagger sat in the front row in a button-down shirt he had ironed himself and testified about being called into the mall manager's office and fired for filming the truth. He said it exactly that way. Fired for filming the truth. And nobody in the room corrected his phrasing because nobody could. Angela presented her closing argument standing still, without notes. She was concise and devastating. When she finished, she sat down and put her hand over Marco's on the table. The gallery was silent. Judge Franklin Birch looked at his notes for a long moment. He was 63 years old, had been on this bench for 12 years, and had the careful, unrevealing face of a man who had made a career out of not showing his hand. Angela watched him. She had done everything right. She knew she had done everything right. The video was irrefutable. The affidavit was documented. The pattern was clear. She had given this judge every tool he needed to do the right thing, wrapped and presented and placed directly in front of him. He cleared his throat. He denied the motion. His stated reasoning was procedural. The matter was premature for dismissal and should proceed to trial where all evidence could be properly weighed. Dillon's affidavit was ruled inadmissible on a technical filing ground that Angela had never seen applied in this jurisdiction in 15 years of practice. The gallery erupted. Birch's gavel came down hard and repeatedly. Angela sat very still. Outside on the courthouse steps, the crowd that had gathered fell completely silent when they saw her face emerge through the doors. 300 people reading one expression and understanding exactly what it meant. In the car, with the doors closed and the noise outside muffled to a low hum, Angela put her face in her hands. Marco put his hand on her shoulder. "I've been in worse places than this," he said quietly, "and I'm still here." She nodded. She didn't lift her face for a long time. Angela didn't sleep. She sat at Marco's kitchen table until 3 in the morning with the denied motion in front of her and a legal pad full of calculations that kept coming out the same way no matter how she ran them. Trial meant Judge Birch. Birch meant Glassner's fingerprints on every ruling. Glassner meant a DA who needed a conviction to keep his machine running. And a conviction meant her 68-year-old father, a man who had bled for this country in places the country still wouldn't officially acknowledge, spending years inside a Georgia correctional facility for defending himself after a cop hit him twice in a shopping mall. She ran the numbers again. They didn't change. She went to bed at 3:15. She heard Marco in his room. Still, quiet. The steady breathing of a man who had learned to sleep in far more dangerous circumstances than this. That somehow made it worse. She lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought about Glassner sitting in his office right now, comfortable, certain, having watched his judge perform exactly as expected. She thought, not yet. She was back at the table by 6. At 6:47, her phone rang. She didn't recognize the number. She answered anyway. The voice on the other end was unhurried and clear, and carried the particular authority of a man who had spent decades being the most important person in every room he entered, and had long since stopped needing to announce it. Ms. Calvert-Reeves, my name is Rudy Ashford. I believe you've read my statement. She straightened in her chair. General Ashford, yes, sir. Thank you for... I watched the ruling last night, he said. I've also watched every other thing that's happened to your father in the last 3 weeks. A pause. I'm coming to Caldwell. I'm bringing 3 men who served alongside Marco between 1988 and 2004, and I am going to speak to the national press for the first time in 22 years. Angela was quiet for a moment. General, I want to make sure you understand what... Ms. Calvert-Reeves. His voice was patient, but immovable. I commanded Special Operations Forces for 30 years. I understand the terrain. Another pause, shorter. Nobody puts one of my soldiers in handcuffs for protecting a young woman from a bully with a badge and gets to call it justice. Not while I'm breathing. She exhaled slowly. When can you be here? 3 days, he said. Make sure there are cameras. The second thing happened that same morning, 40 minutes later. Kevin Jagger called Angela's cell. She had given him her card at the courthouse just in case, and his voice had the particular tight energy of someone who has discovered something and is moving fast before they lose their nerve. He told her about the cloud backup. His phone had automatically saved the original uncompressed video file to a cloud server the night it was filmed. Before his account was flagged, before the mall fired him, before anyone knew to look for it. Full resolution. Original timestamp. Every second intact. Angela gripped the phone tighter. Kevin had already contacted Darlene Ruiz, a national journalist who had been covering the story for a major outlet since the video first broke. Darlene had the file. She had also been independently cross-referencing it with the mall security footage referenced in the original police incident report. She had filed a FOIA request for that footage. The mall denied it. She filed again, this time citing the specific server infrastructure from the mall's own security contractor documentation. Details she had obtained through separate source reporting. The mall's legal team responded by confirming the footage existed while arguing it was proprietary. Angela closed her eyes briefly. Amateurs. That confirmation was legally sufficient for Darlene's network to pursue a court order compelling release. The order was already in motion. Kevin, Angela said, you did good. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, they fired me for filming the truth. Figured I should keep using it. The third thing didn't involve Angela at all. Penny Dillon drove to Atlanta alone. She didn't call ahead. She parked in a public garage 2 blocks from the federal building, walked in through the main entrance carrying a canvas bag with 2 flash drives and a printed index, and told the front desk she needed to speak with someone from the FBI Civil Rights Division. She sat across from a federal agent for 6 hours. She gave them everything, all 14 complaints, every piece of documentation tracking their burial, every communication in which Glassner had personally directed her to close a case. She answered every question completely and without hesitation, the way a person answers questions when they have been waiting a long time to be asked them. By the end of that week, the FBI had opened a formal civil rights investigation into the Caldwell Police Department. Glassner didn't know yet, but the ground under him had already started to move. The court order came through on a Thursday morning. Darlene Ruiz was in her rental car outside a Caldwell coffee shop when her network's legal team called to confirm it. She thanked them, ended the call, and sat quietly for a moment with her phone in her lap. 12 years of investigative journalism had taught her to hold good news carefully, to not let it run ahead of the facts. The order compelled release of the mall's full backup security footage. What that footage actually contained was still, until she watched it, an open question. She watched it 2 hours later in a conference room at her network's Atlanta bureau, with her producer beside her and a legal observer at the end of the table. Nobody spoke for the first 4 minutes. Then Darlene said, "Stop it there." The timestamp read 4:31 p.m., 16 minutes before Fisher's encounter with Bella Darter. The camera angle covered the service corridor running behind the clothing store. A wide shot, slightly elevated, clear and unobstructed. Chester Fisher was standing with a fellow officer near the corridor entrance. They were relaxed, laughing. The kind of easy, loose body language that belongs to men who feel completely unobserved. Then Fisher turned toward the clothing store entrance, visible at the edge of the frame, and drew his right hand back in a slow, theatrical arc, miming a slap. His mouth was moving. The fellow officer laughed harder. Fisher did it twice. Then they straightened up as a shopper passed nearby, and by 4:33 p.m., Fisher had moved back into the main atrium. Darlene watched it 3 more times. She watched the timestamp. She watched the body language. She watched the practiced ease of the gesture. Not the angry impulse of a man who would later feel provoked, but the relaxed rehearsal of a man who had already decided what he was going to do, and found it funny. He wasn't reacting to a threat. He was planning a performance. The broadcast went out that evening on the network's national platform. Darlene presented the footage without narration for the first 30 seconds, just the timestamp, the corridor, the gesture, and the laughter. Then she spoke. She was precise, and she was devastating, and she did not editorialize beyond the facts, because the facts were already more than enough. Within 2 hours, the story had transformed. What had been a viral video about a remarkable old man was now documented evidence of premeditated civil rights abuse by a uniformed officer in a public space. National civil rights organizations issued formal statements before midnight calling for immediate federal intervention. 4 attorneys contacted Angela's firm offering to join the case pro bono. 2 former law enforcement officials appeared on national television describing what they saw in the footage as grounds for immediate termination and federal prosecution. Angela watched the broadcast at Marco's kitchen table. Eric sat across from her. Marco stood in the doorway to the hallway, arms folded, watching the screen without expression. When it ended, Eric said, "Lord have mercy." Marco said nothing. He went to the kitchen, filled a glass of water, and drank it slowly at the counter. Angela called Darlene directly. "The 4-minute mark," she said. "I need a certified copy of the full, unedited file for the federal record." Darlene said, "Already prepared. It'll be in your inbox by morning." Glassner's office released a statement at 11 that night. It was 3 paragraphs long. It described the footage as being taken out of context and emphasized that Officer Fisher had been responding to a developing situation in the store and that the department stood fully behind its officers pending the conclusion of all relevant investigations. Darlene Ruiz addressed the statement on air the following morning. She pulled up the timestamp data. She walked through the 16-minute gap between the corridor footage and Fisher's approach to Bella Darter. She noted, precisely and without visible emotion, that a developing situation that had not yet developed could not reasonably be described as the context for a gesture made 16 minutes before any incident occurred. The statement disappeared from the Caldwell PD website by noon. No replacement was issued. That evening, Angela arrived home to find Marco in the garden in the cold, as always. She stood at the back door and watched him for a moment, moving between the beds, patient, unhurried, tending things that were already tended. She thought about Fisher in that corridor, laughing. She thought about her father at the jewelry counter, deliberate, quiet, buying a necklace for his granddaughter. She went inside and added the certified footage file to the Federal Record Index. Then she called General Ashford to confirm his arrival. He picked up on the first ring. The call came on a Friday morning. Angela was at the kitchen table reviewing the Federal Record Index when her phone buzzed. The number was the DA's office main line. She looked at it for one full ring before she answered. The voice on the other end belonged to a young woman who introduced herself as a member of D.A. Creed's administrative staff. She spoke in the careful, neutral tone of someone reading from a script they had been given that morning and told to follow precisely. "D.A. Creed would like to schedule a call," the assistant said, "to discuss a possible resolution to the Calvert matter. At the earliest convenience of Ms. Calvert Reeves." Angela set her pen down. "Put him on," she said. A brief pause, then, "The DA is unavailable at this." "Then tell him I'm available at 9 o'clock Monday morning," Angela said, "and tell him to be ready to talk about a full dismissal. Not a reduction, not a quiet filing. A full public dismissal with a signed statement of no wrongdoing. Those are my terms. He can think about them over the weekend." She ended the call. She sat for a moment with her hand resting on the phone. Outside, the December morning was gray and still. She could hear Marco moving in the back of the house, the quiet, methodical sounds of a man going about his morning. She picked up her phone again and called Diane in Atlanta. "Creed's office just reached out," she said. Diane was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then, "He's looking for a way out." "He's looking for a quiet way out," Angela said. "He's not getting one." Creed called personally at 8:57 Monday morning, 3 minutes early, which told Angela everything she needed to know about how his weekend had gone. He was smooth about it. She had to give him that. He used measured language, phrases like mutual resolution and the interests of the community, and acknowledging the complexity of the situation. He suggested a reduced charge, a public statement expressing regret for any distress caused, and a commitment to department review. Angela let him finish. Then she spoke. "Mr. Creed," she said, "my client is a 68-year-old Medal of Honor recipient who was struck twice by a uniformed officer in a public mall while defending a young black woman who had a receipt in her hand. Your office charged him with felony assault and resisting detainment. You did this after receiving a video watched by 40 million people. a 4-year complaint file documenting a pattern of civil rights violations, and a written statement from a 4-star general. She paused. So here is what my client will accept. A full public dismissal of all charges, with prejudice. A formal written statement of no wrongdoing, signed by you personally, read aloud at a press conference. Nothing less. Silence on the line. And if we proceed to trial, she continued, you will do so with General Rudy Paul Ashford and 3 decorated Delta Force veterans seated behind the defense table. You will do so with the FBI's Civil Rights Division actively investigating your department's pattern of conduct. You will do so with Darlene Ruiz in the front row and Lieutenant Dillon's 4-year complaint file entered into the federal record. And you will do so knowing that the security footage showing Officer Fisher miming the slap 16 minutes before it happened has been certified and preserved and is ready to play for any jury in this state. She stopped. Let it sit. Walter Creed breathed on the other end of the line. I'll need until tomorrow morning, he said. You have until 8 a.m., Angela said. Have a good day. She ended the call and sat very still for a moment. Her hands were steady. Her heart was not. She found Marco in the garden, crouching near the rose bed with a hand trowel, doing something careful with the soil around the base of one of Claire's plants. She said, Daddy. He looked up. It's over, she said. Creed's going to agree. He'll call tomorrow, but he's already decided. She paused. All charges. Full dismissal. Public statement. Marco looked at her for a long moment. He set the trowel down. Bella Darter, he said. Has she been told? I'll call her this afternoon. He nodded. He picked up the trowel again. Then he said, What's the weather supposed to be like on Thursday? Angela stared at him. Then she laughed. Really laughed. The kind that came from somewhere deep and tired and relieved. For the first time in 3 weeks. She went inside and called Eric. He answered on the first ring, like he'd been sitting beside the phone the whole time. Thursday came cold and clear. By 9 in the morning, 300 people had gathered on the steps and sidewalk outside Caldwell County Courthouse. They came in coats and scarves, breath visible in the December air. Some had driven hours. Some had been there since 8. A woman near the front held a hand-lettered sign that read simply, We saw the video. Nobody asked her to put it down. News cameras lined the perimeter 3 deep. Darlene Ruiz stood near the front with her producer, notepad in hand, watching the courthouse doors. Angela arrived with Marco at 9:45. He was in his dark suit and white shirt, unhurried, moving through the crowd the way he moved everywhere, with a quiet, settled deliberateness that made people step back, not from intimidation, but from something more like instinct, like the way a room goes still when something significant enters it. Eric walked at his left, Angela at his right. General Rudy Paul Ashford was already on the steps in full-dress uniform, ribbons and decorations arranged across his chest in the precise, formal language of a military career that spanned 30 years and 3 continents. He was 74 years old, and he stood like a man who had never once in his life slouched. 3 men flanked him. Older, civilian clothes, the particular stillness of men who had operated in places that didn't make the news. They said nothing. They didn't need to. Bella Darter stood in the front row in a gray coat, hands folded in front of her. She had not been asked to come. She had come anyway. Kevin Jagger stood 2 rows back in the same button-down shirt he had ironed for the hearing. He had nowhere else to be. Community college started in January. Walter Creed appeared at 10 o'clock, precisely through the courthouse doors. He was alone. No aide. No union representative. He had the careful, compressed expression of a man who had made a decision that was going to cost him politically and had spent the last 3 days making peace with that. He approached the microphone stand that had been set up on the landing. He unfolded his statement. The crowd went completely silent. Not the polite silence of ceremony. The absolute silence of 300 people who had driven here, stood in the cold, and were not going to miss a single word. Creed read it straight through without looking up. All charges against Marco James Calvert were dismissed with prejudice, effective immediately. There was no legal basis for the charges as filed. The Caldwell District Attorney's Office formally acknowledged that Mr. Calvert's actions on the date in question were consistent with lawful self-defense and the defense of another civilian. The office expressed its sincere regret for the harm caused to Mr. Calvert, to his family, and to the community of Caldwell. He signed his name at the bottom, folded the paper, stepped back from the microphone. The crowd erupted. The consequences came in the days that followed, and they came in sequence, and none of them were quiet. Chester Fisher was federally indicted on 3 counts of civil rights violations, built from the pattern documented across Dillon's 14 complaints. 6 of the 14 individuals, watching the case finally move, came forward with formal statements. Fisher was suspended without pay. He issued no public statement. He did not appear in front of cameras. He had nothing left to perform for. Bill Glassner resigned from the Caldwell Police Department 4 days after the courthouse steps. He submitted the resignation in writing, without public comment, before the formal federal request for his termination could be issued. The City Council accepted it in an emergency session held in a room that had not had an empty seat since the notice went out. He left the building through a side door. The machine he had spent 20 years building had no ceremony left to offer him. Federal obstruction charges followed within the week. Judge Franklin Birch received formal notification that a judicial conduct complaint, filed by Angela and co-signed by 2 civil rights organizations, had been accepted for review by the Georgia Judicial Qualifications Commission. Kevin Jagger's civil settlement with the mall included a formal written apology, full financial restitution for his wrongful termination, and a payment that covered his first year of community college. He declined reinstatement. He enrolled in January. Bella Darter filed a civil suit against the Caldwell PD and Riverside Commons Mall. With Angela's team and the weight of available evidence, it settled before it ever saw a courtroom. Penny Dillon was reinstated with full back pay by federal directive. 3 months later, she was promoted to captain. She filled the vacancy left by the man who had buried 14 names in a drawer. On her first day in the office, she walked to that drawer, opened it, and closed it for the last time, empty, in front of her assembled team. Nobody said anything. Nobody needed to. 3 weeks after the courthouse steps, it was cold enough that you could see your breath inside the church hall if you stood near the doors. Someone had put white tablecloths on the folding tables. Someone else had arranged small American flags at intervals along the center, evenly spaced, the way you space things when you want them to look like they were planned by someone who cared enough to measure. A woman from the church kitchen had made sweet potato pie and put it on a side table near the window, where the smell of it moved through the room like something warm and deliberate. About 40 people filled the space. Not a large crowd. Not meant to be. General Rudy Paul Ashford had arranged it. He had made 4 phone calls, and the thing had simply appeared. The way things appear when the person organizing them has spent a career making complicated things happen in difficult places with limited resources and no margin for error. 3 of the men who had come with him to the courthouse steps were here tonight. in dress uniforms that no longer quite fit the way they once had. Broader in the middle now, narrower in the shoulders, the way time reshapes men who used to be built for specific and violent purposes. They stood together near the back wall with the easy, wordless comfort of people who had spent years trusting each other in the dark. Eric Washington sat in the second row with a handkerchief already in his hand. He had brought it knowing he would need it. He was not embarrassed about this. Bella Darter sat in the third row in a dark green dress. She had not been certain she belonged here tonight. Angela had called her personally and told her she did. Jessica sat in the front row. She was 12 years old, and she was wearing the necklace. The silver star on the thin chain, bought at a jewelry counter in Riverside Commons Mall on a Tuesday in December by a grandfather who had stood at the glass case for 4 minutes, debating whether she would like it. She had loved it immediately. She had not taken it off. Marco wore the Medal of Honor. Angela had asked him the night before, standing in the kitchen while he washed the dinner dishes, speaking to his back because she thought it might be easier that way. He had been quiet for a moment. Then he had said, "All right, just that. All right," like it was a small thing, like he was agreeing to take an umbrella. He sat in the front row beside Jessica and looked straight ahead, while General Ashford stood at the front of the room and spoke without notes, the way a man speaks when the words have been living inside him for a long time and no longer need to be written down. Ashford talked about Mogadishu. He talked about October 4th, 1993, and what that day had cost, and what it had looked like from where he was standing, and what it had looked like, according to the men who were there, from where Marco was standing. He talked about a soldier who saw civilians in a collapsing situation and moved toward them instead of away. Who made a decision, not under order, not under instruction, purely from the unambiguous internal compass of a man who understood that some things were simply not negotiable, to put himself between those people and what was coming for them. He looked at Marco. "You have been doing this your entire life," he said. "What happened in that mall was not an exception." He paused. It was a Tuesday. The room was very quiet. Marco stood when it was his turn. He thanked Angela first. He said her name and looked at her and didn't elaborate because some things don't need elaboration. He looked at Eric, who was already crying and not apologizing for it. Marco almost smiled. He looked at Bella Darter in the third row. He said her name clearly, so the whole room heard it. Then he said, "I was raised to believe that when you see something wrong, you have an obligation. Not an option, an obligation." He paused. "That's not Delta Force. That's my mother." Eric laughed first. Then the room laughed. Then Marco sat down, because he was not a man who lingered in the light longer than necessary. After the formal portion ended, Jessica climbed into the chair beside him. She leaned against his arm the way she had since she was small. He put one hand over hers on the white tablecloth. Through the window behind them, the December garden was visible in the dark. Claire's roses, replanted, tended, still standing through the cold. He didn't look like a hero. He looked like a grandfather at a party. He looked exactly like what he was. If you enjoyed the story, leave a like to support my channel, and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. On the screen, I have picked 2 special stories just for you. Have a wonderful day.